Some crimes are written not in ink, but in the faintest scratches left upon a desk. It begins on a fog-laden morning in Bloomsbury, where a murdered telegraphist is found with a message too dangerous to survive him, and where Holmes discerns that the wires of progress may also carry the whispers of betrayal. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. Come, the signal has already been sent. Let us follow it to its end. It has often seemed to me that London, with its restless energy and unceasing tide of invention, contains within its very arteries the seeds of its own mischief. The iron rails had already lengthened a criminal's stride, and now the electric telegraph lent to deceit a swiftness which honest labour could scarcely equal. On certain mornings, when the fog clung to Baker Street like a shroud, I could not help but feel that wickedness travelled as swiftly along the wires as the noble impulses of mercy or love. It was upon such a morning, cold and dim, that I found my friend Sherlock Holmes once again absorbed in the peculiar amusement which he styled his intellectual breakfast. There he sat, cross-legged in his chair, the morning paper spread across his knees, with a dozen scraps of past editions arranged in curious order upon the table. His keen eyes darted from line to line, and from time to time he gave vent to a soft chuckle of approval, as if congratulating some hidden correspondent who had contrived a clever cipher. "You see, Watson," he remarked without looking up, "truth is too slow for our age. It must therefore disguise itself as nonsense, and only the attentive will notice." He tapped a string of figures, positively gleeful at their obscurity. Before I could request an explanation, there came a sharp rap at the door, unusually brisk for so early an hour. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a figure muffled against the damp, who cast an anxious glance about the room before stepping across the threshold. "A visitor in distress, Watson," murmured Holmes, his nostrils flaring like a hound's. "Note the urgency of his tread." The stranger's breathing was short, his movements jerky, and though he sought composure, I could read the silent appeal in his eyes as he removed his sodden hat. He was a man of middle years, with thinning hair brushed too carefully forward, and a complexion which spoke of long confinement in offices. Yet it was his hands that drew my attention first, one encased in a worn kid glove, the other bare and ink-stained, betraying habits of constant writing. His cuffs were uneven, and his coat, though of respectable cut, bore the dust of hurried travel. He clutched his umbrella so tightly that it quivered. In his awkwardness, he presented a pitiable sight, though there was an unmistakable dignity beneath the nervous tremor of his voice. Holmes, who had not yet risen from his chair, cast a single piercing glance at the fellow and then folded his paper. He spoke no word. But I knew that, in that instant, my friend had read more of the man's history than a lifetime of confidences could reveal. For myself, I could perceive little beyond his unease, but it was enough to assure me that some grave matter pressed heavily upon him. He looked at Holmes, as one might look at a physician before confessing an illness, torn between dread of exposure and desperation for relief. When at last the man spoke, his voice faltered, yet each phrase was burdened with urgency. "Mr. Holmes," he began, "I come to you upon a matter which cannot be trusted to the ordinary authorities. A life has been taken, but the greater danger lies in what may already have passed unseen along the wires." Holmes inclined his head ever so slightly. "Ah," said he, "then we are not to speak of theft or vulgar burglary. The shadow is larger, I think, one of secrecy, silence, and perhaps foreign hands." The stranger introduced himself as Mr. Horace Milburn, manager of the small telegraph office in Bloomsbury. His words were measured, yet there was a strain beneath his politeness, as though each sentence cost him an effort of will. I noticed that his gaze seldom rested upon Holmes, but wandered instead to the corners of the room, as though he feared some invisible auditor might be present. "I come, Mr. Holmes, not in my own stead, but compelled by circumstances which leave me no alternative," he said. His fingers worked nervously at the brim of his hat, and I could not help but feel a wave of sympathy for him. Yet Holmes, with that cool detachment which never deserted him, leaned back in his chair and murmured, "Pray proceed, sir. The manner of your entrance speaks more eloquently than any apology could." Milburn moistened his lips before continuing. "It concerns my night telegraphist, Mr. Samuel Rigby. The man was young, diligent, and ambitious, but I fear he has met a most untimely end. This very morning, when the clerk came to relieve him, Rigby was found slumped over the desk, his hand still resting upon the key. The apparatus was alive with its clicking, and a half-written message lay beneath his arm." He paused, as though the recollection oppressed him. There were no signs of struggle beyond a toppled chair, no weapon, and yet his life had departed. The doctor who examined him could suggest little beyond a sudden failure of the heart, but I, who knew the man, cannot accept such a facile explanation. Rigby was in the prime of his strength. No, gentlemen, I believe there was foul play, though the marks of it are strangely absent. At this point, Milburn leaned forward, lowering his voice, as though fearful that even Mrs. Hudson in the hall might overhear. "There is another element, Mr. Holmes. Of the several telegrams received during the night, all remain properly filed except one. A single slip is missing. The clerk who discovered the body swears that Rigby's hand grasped it when first he was found. But before I myself arrived, it had vanished entirely. The box was unforced, the drawers unopened, the till untouched. Nothing else in the office was disturbed. Only that one message, gone, as though spirited away. I confess I started at this singular detail, for it lent a new complexion to the business. A stolen telegram, Watson," said Holmes softly, "is a rarer quarry than a stolen purse, and often far more dangerous to the one who hunts it." Milburn gave a weary shrug. The police, of course, were summoned without delay. Inspector Jarvis examined the room, made a few perfunctory notes, and pronounced it the work of a thief. He believes Rigby surprised the fellow rifling the drawer and paid with his life for his zeal. Yet nothing was taken, save this one slip, which they dismiss as insignificant. I attempted to suggest otherwise, but the inspector was unmoved. "Another clerk with debts," he said. "Another robbery gone awry." "That is the official account, Mr. Holmes, but I cannot reconcile it with the facts before me. It was no common housebreaker. I fear it was something darker, and that my office, humble though it seems, may have become a theatre for designs beyond its walls." While Milburn spoke, Holmes's eyes travelled not to his face but to his person, noting each detail with a dispassionate keenness. "You came directly from your office, sir," he remarked suddenly, "though you would prefer us to believe otherwise. The dust upon your right boot is of the paving stones around Bloomsbury Square, and your coat is still damp with the fog of early morning. Moreover, the cut of that waistcoat is of a regimental pattern, though it has been altered to civilian wear. Your association with the War Office is not merely casual." Milburn started as though struck, then attempted a faltering denial, which Holmes waved aside with a smile of quiet amusement. "Come, sir, we need not waste time in fencing. Your anxiety is not for poor Rigby's body, though it lies cold enough, but for what his restless fingers may have transmitted before they grew stiff." The manager's face grew pallid, and he twisted his hands together in helpless agitation. "You are right, Mr. Holmes," he whispered. "It is not the death alone that terrifies me, grievous though it is. It is the knowledge that something dangerous may already have sped upon the wires before he fell. I have reason to believe that Rigby was tampered with, persuaded, perhaps even bribed, to send what should never have left English soil. If so, the consequences could be grave indeed, both to myself and to the service which I represent." He broke off abruptly, his eyes darting from Holmes to myself, as though fearful of betrayal. Holmes, however, showed neither surprise nor indignation. He merely steepled his fingers and regarded the unhappy man with that cool scrutiny which seemed to strip all pretense away. "I think we approach the heart of the matter," said he, "though you do not yet confide it to us." For my own part, I could not dismiss the impression that our visitor spoke half in truth, and half in concealment. There was more behind his pallor than dread of scandal, more in his agitation than grief for a murdered subordinate. Holmes, however, appeared content for the moment to let the matter rest. "Very well, Mr. Milburn," said he, rising at last. "You shall have the benefit of my best attention. Watson and I will examine the scene with our own eyes, and I make no promise beyond this, that if there is a thread, however fine, we shall tug it until the whole fabric comes loose." With that, the poor man bowed in gratitude, though his eyes remained haunted. It was scarcely an hour later when Holmes summoned me to accompany him into the chill of that November morning. The fog clung low over the pavements, and the gas lamps burned faintly, mere smudges of yellow in the grey expanse. As our cab rattled eastward toward Bloomsbury, I could not banish from my thoughts the haunted eyes of Mr. Milburn, nor the strange sense that he bore within him a truth too perilous to confess. Holmes sat in silence, his chin sunk upon his breast, the fingers of one hand drumming lightly against the sill. At length he remarked, "You perceive, Watson, how progress breeds its own perils. Each wire that carries goodwill is equally apt to convey treachery. Our task is not only to catch the hand that moves, but to trace the thought that guides it." His words deepened the gloom that already hung heavy upon my mind, for in that mist-bound city it seemed that shadows themselves whispered secrets. We were conducted without delay into the offices where Rigby had met his mysterious end. The place was small and orderly, yet bore that peculiar odour of hot metal and stale ink which belongs to such establishments. The lamps still burned, for the fog denied the daylight entrance, and their dim glow cast a pallor over the desks and instruments. At one table the clerk on duty looked up with startled curiosity at our arrival, then bent quickly to his work, as though fearful of Holmes's eye. Milburn, who had joined us, pointed with trembling hand to the very desk where his unfortunate subordinate had been discovered. The chair lay toppled to one side, and on the floor beneath it were scattered fragments of paper. Holmes bent low, his gaze roving over every detail with that concentration which, once fastened upon its object, nothing could divert. "Observe, Watson," he murmured, "how silence speaks more eloquently than sound." Among the trifles on Rigby's desk lay the stub of a wooden match, blackened and curled at the edge, yet still possessing its full length. Holmes lifted it delicately between thumb and forefinger, holding it up to the lamplight. "Here is an eloquent witness," said he, "a match that has been lit, extinguished before its work was done, and then cast aside. Consider, Watson, had the man struck it to light his pipe, there would be ashes in the tray. Had it served to kindle the lamp, it would not lie so unconsumed. No, this flame was quenched suddenly, either by a gust of motion or by a hand too hurried to complete the act. I protested that such a fragment might prove little." Holmes smiled thinly. "On the contrary, it speaks of interruption, of haste, perhaps even of fear. The hand that struck it did not belong to one at leisure, but to one compelled by urgent circumstance. There, Watson, lies a clue of more significance than half the police reports of London." Holmes next examined the blotter upon Rigby's desk, a thick pad of paper worn with countless impressions. With his lens, he peered closely at the faint indentations, then drew from his pocket a small phial of pencil dust, which he scattered lightly over the surface. As he tilted it, the ghost of words began to appear, rising like phantoms from the page. "You see, Watson," said he, "the hand that writes leaves its confession even when the ink is gone." Slowly, the characters resolved themselves, a broken sentence, incomplete, yet hinting at a darker purpose. "Package, Charing Cross, tonight," Holmes read aloud, his voice low and intent. The hairs rose at the back of my neck, for here was evidence that Rigby had indeed transmitted a message of grave import. Holmes carefully copied the faint impressions into his notebook. "We do not yet know what this package was, nor to whom it was directed. But that it was of consequence, I have little doubt. For men do not kill to conceal trivialities. Holmes next directed my gaze to a curious indentation along the edge of the desk, scarcely visible except in a certain light. He ran his finger along it, then nodded gravely. This, Watson, is no ordinary mark of wear. It was made by pressure, sudden and violent. Consider, Rigby's hand, perhaps clutching the edge in desperation, dragged downwards as he was struck. The wood, though stout, bears the scar of his last effort. Thus we know that he did not die by chance or sudden illness. He struggled, silently, perhaps briefly, but struggled nonetheless. My heart tightened at this evidence of the man's final moments, so lonely and desperate in that dim-lit office. A fight without noise, Holmes murmured. How efficient the killer must have been, and how practiced. For silence in violence is the mark of one who has rehearsed the act. From the blotter's faint message, Holmes now pieced together the fuller sense of Rigby's last work. He laid his notes upon the desk and considered them with knitted brows. We have here the mention of a package, Watson, and an appointment at Charing Cross. Such words are never innocent. They speak not of a friend's parcel, but of something heavier in import, perhaps in danger. Consider, too, that it was this slip, above all others, which vanished. What thief troubles to steal one fragment while leaving? The till untouched? No. The object of desire was the message itself. He leaned back, folding his arms. Charing Cross, of all stations, serves as the artery to the continent. The time, the place, the secrecy, all point to something beyond the ken of an ordinary clerk. My companion's eyes gleamed with that peculiar fire I knew so well. It is espionage, Watson, and espionage is murder's elder brother. Holmes did not confine his inquiries to the dead man's desk alone. He summoned the clerks one by one, and though each professed ignorance, their tongues loosened under his searching gaze. One spoke of Rigby's ambition, how he dreamed of rising beyond his humble station. Another muttered of late hours spent in questionable company, men whose speech carried the accent of the docks, and whose purposes were vague. Yet there was also mention of a lady, finely dressed, glimpsed in conversation with Rigby near the office door on more than one occasion. These scattered fragments, trifling in themselves, seemed to Holmes as pieces of a puzzle which, once fitted, would reveal the larger pattern. Ambition, secrecy, and strange companionship, said he afterwards. Our Mr. Rigby was entangled in something far beyond the wages of a telegraph clerk. Mark me, Watson, where the threads of commerce and confidence cross, there too do we find the shadow of intrigue. While Holmes questioned the clerks, I encountered Inspector Jarvis once more, who greeted me with cordiality. Sad affair, Doctor, said he, shaking his head. But I've seen it before, a promising lad undone by the cards. They say Rigby owed money to some rough fellows near Holborn, and no doubt they came to collect. He resisted, and you see the end of it. I ventured to suggest that the missing telegram might indicate a different motive, but Jarvis only laughed. Ah, you and Mr. Holmes are ever for mysteries. Depend upon it, sir, it was debt that killed him. There is no darker motive in half the cases of London. With this comfortable assurance, the inspector took his leave, leaving me perplexed and not a little irritated at his complacency. When I repeated the inspector's theory to Holmes, he merely raised his brows with that expression of amused contempt which I had seen him wear upon many such occasions. Gambling debts, Watson, he said dryly, are the convenient cloak of every crime. When an official grows weary of inquiry, he wraps the corpse in that garment and departs, satisfied. But I tell you this. Rigby's death was not the work of common brutes seeking payment. It was too silent, too precise, and above all, too purposeful. The theft of the telegram is the key, and debts, real or imagined, are but a veil thrown across the eyes of the indolent. No, my dear fellow, this is the footprint of espionage, and if I mistake not, the path will lead us to a revelation of considerable magnitude. Holmes's inquiries were never confined to the scene itself, for he possessed an uncanny ability to trace threads invisible to ordinary men. By midday, he had obtained through certain unofficial channels the knowledge that Rigby had, for some weeks past, been exchanging coded communications with a correspondent in France. The fact startled me beyond expression. "Do you mean," I cried, "that this humble clerk was engaged in espionage?" Holmes, seated with folded arms, gave me a look of quiet amusement. "Not engaged, Watson. Entangled. There is a vast difference. A moth that flutters too near the flame is not in league with the candle, yet it may perish all the same." The information, he explained, had reached him from a source within the postal authorities, who had observed irregular transmissions. The correspondence was cloaked in innocent commercial jargon, but beneath it lurked phrases that pointed unmistakably to military intelligence. Thus it became clear that Rigby's death was not the outcome of common robbery, but the silencing of a man who had strayed into secrets larger than himself. That evening, Holmes proposed an excursion to a tavern in the vicinity of Holborn, a place, he informed me, where Rigby was known to spend his idle hours. To my astonishment, my companion appeared not in his usual attire, but in the rough garments of a workman, his features altered by a smudge of soot and a cunning arrangement of hair. "Holmes!" I exclaimed, hardly recognizing him. He laughed softly. "Come, Watson, do not gape like a country cousin. I have no wish to frighten the birds before they flutter." Within the tavern, thick with smoke and the clamour of voices, I kept close at his side, while he affected the manner of a tradesman down on his luck. He mingled freely, his ears ever alert, and more than once I caught the glint of satisfaction in his eye. To me, the noise was bewildering, the slang unintelligible, but Holmes seemed to gather sense where I heard only babble. At length he drew me aside, whispering, "There is talk of Rigby, and more than talk of those with whom he kept strange company. Mark it well, Watson. The wires of this city carry more than messages. They carry whispers of betrayal." It was during this strange masquerade that Holmes's ear caught mention of a detail which altered the complexion of the case. Among the rough talk of dock labourers and clerks, one voice spoke of a lady, finely dressed, elegant in manner, and wholly unsuited to such surroundings, who had been seen conversing with Rigby on more than one occasion. "A curious moth for such a flame," murmured Holmes, with that sardonic half-smile of his. The tavern-goers debated whether she was a foreigner or merely of high station, but all agreed that her presence was remarkable. For my part, I could make nothing of it, though my imagination was stirred by the incongruity of such a figure in so lowly a haunt. Holmes, however, appeared far from surprised. "Where intrigue exists, Watson, there you will find a woman, either its victim, its instrument, or its master." I knew better than to press him further, for he was already weaving the lady's shadow into his silent pattern of deduction. When at last we quitted the tavern, I was eager for Holmes's explanation, but he walked in silence until we reached the solitude of our chambers. There, laying aside his disguise with deliberate slowness, he turned to me with grave composure. "Watson, our client, Mr. Milburn, is not the simple manager he would have us believe. His waistcoat betrayed his regimental past, and inquiries I have made confirm that he is still in confidential communication with the War Office. His anxiety, therefore, is not solely for the loss of a subordinate, but for the peril of exposure. If Rigby trafficked, even unwittingly, in intelligence touching military matters, then Milburn's office became a gateway through which secrets might slip across the channel." I protested that such a scheme demanded foreign agents, yet Holmes shook his head. "No, my dear fellow, foreign hands may have sought the knowledge, but it was an English hand that stilled Rigby's pulse. Depend upon it, the nearer the enemy, the less he is suspected. We must look not abroad but within, for treachery is most deadly when it is clothed in familiar livery." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his long fingers steepled, and regarded me with that air of professorial patience which he often assumed when unfolding his reasoning. "Rigby's position, Watson, was not one of mere accident. Consider his duty. Each night he handled scores of messages, many of which bore upon commerce, finance, even state matters. It needed but a subtle hand to divert or copy certain phrases, and our unfortunate telegraphist found himself transformed into a channel for intelligence. Whether he entered the current willingly or was swept along by stronger wills, we cannot yet say. But that he was used, there can be no doubt. A slip of paper, worth a man's life, is no ordinary message, but one which touches the machinery of nations. Rigby, in his ambition or folly, opened his desk to that tide, and the tide has drowned him. I shivered at his words, for they cast a sombre shadow upon what had seemed at first but an isolated crime. I ventured that foreign agents might easily have arranged his death, but Holmes dismissed the thought with a sharp shake of the head. No, Watson, reflect. An outsider would have required entry, opportunity, and silence, all perilous obstacles. Rigby died at his own desk, in a building watched by colleagues. Only one with free passage could have acted so swiftly and departed unobserved. No stranger would risk discovery in so narrow a window of time. He rose and paced the room. No, the true danger lies nearer. It is not the hand across the channel, but the hand across the desk. One of Rigby's own circle feared exposure, or sought to possess, the very slip he carried. The foreign power is but the customer, the seller is within. He paused, his keen eyes bright. It is always thus. We hunt spectres abroad, while the traitor warms himself at our own fire. Remember that, Watson. The deadliest blow comes not from afar, but from one who smiles at your elbow. His words struck me with a peculiar force, for I recalled the nervous tremor of Mr. Milburn and wondered how deep the rot might go. Despite the conviction with which Holmes spoke, I confess my own understanding faltered. But Holmes, I protested, Rigby was but a petty clerk. How could such a man outwit both his superiors and the authorities? Surely espionage demands cunning far above his station. My friend regarded me with a look in which amusement and pity were curiously blended. My dear Watson, you persist in imagining espionage as a game reserved for princes and generals. Yet who is better placed than the humble clerk, whose hands daily touch the wires of empire, and whose face excites no suspicion? In such obscurity lies his opportunity. He need not outwit anyone. He need only carry out small instructions until, step by step, the rope is tied around his neck. And if, in his vanity, he imagines himself a master of intrigue, he is the more easily destroyed. I bit my lip, chastened yet still troubled, for I could not reconcile the Rigby I had heard described with the dark figure Holmes was painting. Holmes, however, seemed content to leave my doubts unsoothed. Instead, he lit his pipe, and the thin blue smoke curled about his head like the mist of some Sibylline oracle. "We shall not have long to wait, Watson," said he. "There is a performance to be given, and I must play my part with precision." "A performance?" I repeated in bewilderment. "Where? And to what end?" He smiled, but offered no explanation. "You shall see it unfold at Charing Cross Station, where the wires meet the rails, and where men imagine their secrets vanish into the crowd. Until then, I ask only your patience." I pressed him further, but he waved away my questions with an almost mischievous humour. "You are an excellent audience, Watson, but a poor actor. Best to leave the stage to me in this instance." His words stirred in me both curiosity and unease, for when Holmes withheld his designs, it was usually because peril lurked at their core. That evening, as we sat once more in Baker Street, Holmes grew uncharacteristically reflective. He stared long into the fire before remarking, "It is not the distant foe that should trouble us, Watson, but the neighbour who holds a duplicate of our key. The most dangerous enemies are those who share one's passage, one's labour, one's confidence, for they know where the locks are weakest." His tone, though calm, carried a weight that chilled me. I ventured to ask whether he suspected a particular individual, but he only replied, "I suspect all, until I can prove one." He then relapsed into silence, puffing gently upon his pipe, while I scribbled notes of our discoveries thus far. The atmosphere in that room was heavy with unspoken menace, and I could not shake the image of Rigby's lifeless hand clinging to its secret message. When Holmes at last rose and extinguished the lamp, he said only, "Sleep well, Watson, but keep your revolver close. I have reason to believe the next act of this drama may be played sooner than we expect." With that ominous admonition, he withdrew to his chamber, leaving me restless long into the night. Holmes wasted no time in setting his stratagem into motion. With a composure that concealed the gravity of the act, he composed a telegram in words so artfully chosen that only one who already knew the game would comprehend their true meaning. "You see, Watson," he explained, "the value of a bait lies in its familiarity. It must be something the fish has already swallowed once before. Therefore, we must fashion our lure not as invention, but as repetition." The telegram spoke of a package to be handed over at Charing Cross, couched in the same veiled language Rigby had employed. It was dispatched from the office with Milburn's reluctant assistance, for the man trembled visibly at the thought of drawing out his enemy. Holmes, however, reassured him with that cool irony which seemed to command obedience. "Fear not, sir, you will play no part upon the stage. My colleague and I shall suffice." Watching the message vanish into the mysterious network of wires, I felt the same chill that had touched me when first I saw Rigby's blotter. For here was bait, bright and deadly, cast upon waters teeming with unseen dangers, and it seemed to me that we too might be hooked upon it. That night was one of the longest I can recall. Sleep fled from me, and I lay in restless speculation as to the outcome of Holmes's design. I admired the precision of his plan, yet my admiration was tempered by a dread which clung ever closer as the hours dragged on. What if the murderer, scenting danger, should choose violence once more? What if Holmes himself, standing too near the flame, became its next victim? My attempts to reason with myself were futile, for I could not still the image of Collard, though I scarcely knew his name then, slipping through the station crowds like a shadow with murder in his pocket. Holmes, for his part, passed the night in perfect equanimity. I rose once to find him in his chair, pipe between his lips, calmly reading a monograph on the chemical peculiarities of tobacco ash. "Your nerves, Watson," he remarked dryly, "are admirable in the field, but lamentably restless in the theatre. Consider this an evening at the opera, where we know the villain will appear at the appointed cue." His humour did little to soothe me, but I confess it impressed me with a confidence I could not otherwise summon. By the appointed hour we were at Charing Cross, where the great concourse of passengers flowed like a human tide through the arches. The air was thick with steam and voices, porters hurried with baggage, clerks darted to and fro, and the whistle of trains pierced the din. To me it was bewildering, but Holmes surveyed it all with the steady gaze of a hunter who knows his quarry must emerge from the cover. "Observe, Watson," said he quietly, "how the guilty man betrays himself not by boldness, but by excess of caution. He will move neither too fast nor too slow, and in that moderation lies his unmasking." We took our station, near the telegraph counters, feigning the indifference of travellers. My eyes searched the throng until they grew weary. Yet Holmes remained as still as a statue, every nerve attuned to the smallest deviation in manner. At last I saw him stiffen. A man of sober aspect, well dressed, and bearing the dignity of long service, was threading his way through the press with a hesitancy that belied his composure. His hand was thrust deep within his coat, his eyes flickered nervously from side to side, and though he affected calm, his every step rang with trepidation. Holmes touched my arm lightly. "The play begins, Watson," he whispered. "The actor has entered." The figure proved to be none other than Henry Collard, a senior clerk in Milburn's office, whose reputation was that of a steady and respectable man. Yet as I watched him, I perceived a tremor in his movements, a furtive clutch at the breast of his coat, where something flat and rectangular seemed concealed. His lips moved as though rehearsing words, and more than once he paused abruptly, only to continue with forced determination. I recalled Holmes's earlier remark about the neighbour with the duplicate key, and I felt the truth of it in my bones. Collard glanced toward the telegraph counter, then toward the foreign departures, as if uncertain to which master he owed allegiance. "A double game, Watson," murmured Holmes softly, "but such games end always in disaster." I marvelled at the man's audacity, yet could not but pity him, for he walked like one already condemned. At that instant, as he reached into his coat, Holmes stepped forward, his expression cold and inexorable. The next moment would decide all, and I confess my own heart throbbed so violently that I scarce dared to draw breath. To my astonishment, as Collard approached the appointed place, a tall figure detached itself from the crowd and moved with quiet certainty to intercept him. For a moment, I scarce believed my eyes, for it was Holmes himself, though so transformed that even I, who know his every line and gesture, had difficulty in recognizing him. The bent posture, the foreign-cut coat, the false whiskers, all lent him the air of a continental agent. Collard halted, his hand trembling upon the packet within his breast. Holmes inclined his head, as though in recognition, and uttered a phrase in guttural French which I could not comprehend. At once Collard's shoulders eased, and I saw a shadow of relief flicker across his anxious face. He had taken the bait. Step by cautious step, he withdrew the packet, glancing about as though fearful of witnesses. My own pulse hammered so loudly that I wondered the entire station did not hear it. Holmes, however, remained cool as ice, his hand steady, his manner one of effortless authority. In that moment, I understood how completely he had assumed the role, and how utterly Collard had delivered himself into the snare. It was at the very instant when the packet passed, from Collard's hand to Holmes, that the trap sprang shut. With a sudden motion, Holmes cast aside his disguise, his clear grey eyes flashing with the triumph of the hunter. "Henry Collard," he said in a voice that rang above the din of the station, "you are taken in the act." The clerk started back, his face blanching to the hue of parchment, but his retreat was cut short as Inspector Lestrade, who had lurked nearby at Holmes's request, laid a firm hand upon his arm. The packet slipped to the ground, where I snatched it up before curious onlookers could interfere. Collard struggled, protesting with frantic energy, but there was a fatal weariness in his efforts, as though he knew the game was lost. Around us the crowd pressed in, murmuring with astonishment, but Holmes's commanding presence silenced their questions. "There is your thief, Inspector," he remarked calmly, caught with the evidence still warm in his grasp. I confess my own heart leapt with relief, for I had half feared some sudden violence. Yet the swiftness of Holmes's revelation left Collard dumbfounded, like a rat exposed beneath a lifted stone. Collard, however, was not a man to yield without desperate resource. Gathering his wits, he straightened and looked about him with a sudden boldness. "You fools," he cried. "You think me the villain, but it is Milburn you should seize. Ask yourselves why Rigby died. Because he stumbled upon his master's secrets. Milburn, with his ties to the War Office, feared exposure, and so arranged his silence. I am but the scapegoat." His words caused a stir among the bystanders, and even Lestrade frowned uncertainly, for it was the kind of assertion that can unsettle weaker minds. Collard pressed his advantage, his voice rising in defiance. "The evidence you hold proves nothing save that I was following orders. It was Milburn's hand that struck the blow. Mine was but the service of obedience." He glared about him, seeking sympathy from the crowd, and for an instant I felt the force of his audacity. But when I glanced at Holmes, I saw upon his features only the faint smile of one who has rehearsed this scene a dozen times already. Holmes waited until the clamour had subsided, then spoke in his measured tones. "A spirited attempt, Collard, but unavailing. You forget that I am not Inspector Jarvis, to be diverted by a convenient cloak. You accuse Milburn because you knew suspicion would fall naturally upon him. But foresight, my dear sir, is a weapon I carry always in reserve." He turned to Lestrade. "Observe, Inspector, that the stolen telegram was concealed in Collard's own breast, not Milburn's. Observe also the indentation upon Rigby's desk, which corresponds with the pressure of Collard's signet ring, a trifle he neglected to remove before laying violent hands upon the victim. And lastly, Recall the half-burnt match. Collard smokes Turkish cigarettes, which require a longer flame to kindle. Rigby, a pipe smoker, would never have struck it thus. The trifles tell the tale. Collard's bravado faltered. His lips moved, but no sound came forth. Holmes's voice cut through his silence like steel. You played for time, Collard, hoping to turn suspicion upon Milburn. But the double bluff is as transparent as glass to eyes accustomed to deceit. The truth stands naked before us. With his disguise cast aside and the evidence secure, Holmes at last unfolded the motive behind the deed. Collard was no patriot, Watson, he said. He was a merchant in secrets, trading them for coin. Rigby, poor fool, stumbled upon the traffic, and whether through conscience or ambition, threatened exposure. That could not be tolerated. Therefore Collard struck swiftly and silently, choosing a moment when the office was deserted. He seized the slip, extinguished the match before its flame betrayed him, and left the corpse to be discovered by innocent hands. Had it not been for the blotter's whisper and the desk's scar, he might have escaped entirely. Holmes's cold analysis stripped away the last remnant of sympathy I might have felt for the man, leaving only the image of Rigby, lifeless at his post, undone by one who should have been his comrade. As Collard was led away in the custody of Lestrade, I felt a mingling of emotions difficult to describe. Relief that the matter had reached its conclusion without further bloodshed. Admiration for the unfaltering brilliance of Holmes's deductions, and yet a lingering melancholy for the wasted promise of Samuel Rigby, whose ambition had brought him into a game too perilous for his grasp. Around us the station resumed its bustle, indifferent to the tragedy just enacted within its walls. Holmes, replacing his gloves with deliberate composure, turned to me with a faint smile. You see, Watson, crime may borrow the wires of civilization, but it cannot alter the current of justice. Sooner or later it meets its conductor. I could not forbear a laugh at his conceit, though my heart was heavy. For if Rigby had been but a pawn, Collard was no more than a knight in a larger contest, and I could not help but wonder what unseen hands still moved upon that shadowed board. It was late in the afternoon when Holmes, Lestrade and I found ourselves once more within the familiar confines of Baker Street. The fire burned brightly, casting its glow upon the worn armchairs and crowded shelves, and I confess that never had the room seemed more like a sanctuary after the tumult of the day. Lestrade, flushed with the triumph of a capture to which his part had been but secondary, settled heavily into a chair with the air of a man at last relieved of a burden. Holmes, however, was as composed as if he had merely concluded a game of chess, his features betraying no elation, only the cold satisfaction of a mind that had seen its plan unfold to the letter. Now, gentlemen, said he, drawing his chair nearer to the hearth, let us examine the steps that brought us to this conclusion. It is a poor sort of victory that leaves its reasons unspoken. I took up my pen, eager as ever to record the exposition, while Lestrade leaned forward, plainly determined to carry away the credit in official reports. Holmes's gaze, calm and unwavering, turned at last to me. Watson, you will recall the trifles, for it is always the trifles that whisper the loudest. Holmes reached across to the mantel and produced the small fragment of wood which he had preserved with care. Here lies the first witness, said he, a common match, and yet uncommon in what it proclaims. You remember where it was found, upon Rigby's desk, unburned to its end, though clearly ignited. Why should a man strike fire and then not employ it? Not for his pipe, for the ashes bore no trace, not for the lamp, for it burned steadily before us. There is but one answer. The flame was quenched in haste. He rolled it delicately between his fingers. The hand that struck it belonged to one who feared light, Watson, not one who sought it. Consider the assassin's position. He comes upon Rigby unexpectedly, the clerk reaching perhaps for another paper. To hide his act, he douses the flame swiftly, lest the sudden flare betray his presence to any passer-by. But in his hurry, he discards the match, leaving it as a silent cry to those who can interpret it. He looked across at Lestrade, who shifted uneasily. Thus the match speaks, Inspector. It tells of intrusion, of stealth, and of violence cloaked in quietness. A whole confession in a charred stick of wood. Holmes next drew forth his notebook, in which he had sketched with care the peculiar indentation upon Rigby's desk. "Our second witness," he said, "is this shallow groove. To your eye, Watson, it seemed trifling. To mine, it cried aloud. Look at the angle, the depth, the splintered edge. Such a mark is not wrought by the careless pressure of daily toil. It was carved in an instant of mortal struggle." He leaned forward, his long finger tracing the line upon the page. Picture Rigby, startled and seized. His hand, grasping for support, drags along the desk's edge with all the force of a man resisting death. The wood gives way, bearing forever the scar of that desperate clutch. There is pathos in that line, Watson, more eloquent than a scream. I confess a shiver passed through me at his words, for the image rose with dreadful clarity before my mind. Holmes continued, his tone as cold as ever. "Such evidence proves what the doctor's verdict could not, that Rigby did not fall by weakness of heart. He fought, however briefly, against the hand that slew him. And if proof were needed of Collard's guilt, it lies here, for his own signet ring matched the very breadth of the pressure." Holmes now turned to the small square of blotting paper which had lain upon Rigby's desk. "The third witness, gentlemen, is mute ink, or rather, the absence of ink. You saw how I dusted its surface with powder, and how the impressions of Rigby's last message rose like phantoms from the grave. Consider the words, package, Charing Cross, tonight. Could coincidence produce such a fragment? Hardly. This was the very telegram which vanished, the one Collard sought to deliver into foreign hands. Robbery, therefore, was never the motive. Murder was committed not to obtain coin, but to intercept a message too dangerous to be read." Lestrade muttered something about cleverness beyond the common run of criminals, but Holmes silenced him with a glance. "Do not imagine, Inspector, that great intrigues demand great men. On the contrary, they demand ordinary men placed in extraordinary positions, men like Collard, whose station gave him access, and whose greed supplied the will. The blotter betrayed him as surely as if Rigby himself had risen to testify." He placed the paper aside with care. "Thus, by trifles overlooked, we restore the words which sealed a man's doom, and by them we trace the hand that struck him down." Holmes now turned his penetrating gaze upon Lestrade, who still toyed uneasily with the packet. "You see, Inspector," said he, "why the theory of foreign assassins was but a blind alley. Consider the circumstances. Rigby was slain silently, without alarm, in a room where every sound is magnified by the ticking of instruments. No stranger could have entered, struck, and departed unseen. The clerks are vigilant, the doors secured, the streets alive with passers-by. An outsider would have left a ripple, yet there was none. The crime must therefore belong to one with lawful access, someone whose presence raised no suspicion. Such a man was Collard. He came and went freely, his seniority shielding him from question, his intimacy with Rigby cloaking his approach. To chase spectres abroad, therefore, was folly. The truth sat in the very chair beside Rigby's own, and only the match, the blotter, and the scarred desk whispered it aloud. Foreign intrigue may have been the market, but the vendor was an Englishman. He concluded with a shrug, as though the deduction were the simplest of syllogisms, while Lestrade muttered his reluctant assent. Holmes's voice softened, though it lost none of its precision. We must give Rigby his due. He was no willing accomplice at the last. When he perceived the nature of Collard's game, he resisted, clutching at the desk as death closed upon him. You saw the groove in the wood, Watson. That was his last testimony. More than that, he sought to guard the message itself, grasping it even as his life ebbed away. Were it not for Collard's superior strength, the slip might have remained in his hand and the foreign buyer disappointed. There is a melancholy courage in that, which we should not overlook. I felt my throat tighten at the picture Holmes painted. Rigby, for all his flaws, had not gone down entirely in dishonour. He had fought, however vainly, to redeem himself. Holmes drew thoughtfully upon his pipe. Yes, Watson, he died in darkness, but not without an effort to save the light. Holmes then addressed Milburn, who had sat silent throughout, his face pale with fatigue and anxiety. Mr. Milburn, said he, you have carried a heavy burden. Your reticence placed you in peril of suspicion, yet I cannot censure it. A man entrusted with matters of the War Office cannot speak freely, even to save himself. Your silence was therefore the offspring of duty, not guilt. Collard exploited that silence, counting on it to shield his own treachery. But the truth has a way of tearing through even the most carefully woven veil. Milburn's lips moved, but for a moment no sound issued. Then he whispered his thanks, his voice thick with relief. I feared, Mr. Holmes, that my very honour would be my undoing. Holmes inclined his head gravely. Honour seldom undoes a man, sir. It is falsehood that snaps the cord. You may sleep with a quieter mind tonight. Rigby's blood is not upon your hands. The poor fellow grasped Holmes's hand with a fervour I had rarely witnessed, his eyes brimming with gratitude, while Lestrade grunted something about the inconvenience of gentlemen who knew too much and spoke too little. Holmes at last opened the packet which I had secured at the station. Its contents were but a single slip of flimsy paper, yet upon it was written intelligence that could have stirred nations. Behold, Watson, said he, passing it to me, the true stake of this contest. It concerns the movement of troops in India, the very disposition of regiments upon which the security of an empire depends. Imagine such knowledge in hostile hands. A regiment shifted here, a frontier left bare there, and you would have rebellion where you expected peace, disaster where you promised safety. That is why Rigby died. He had touched the string of a great instrument, and the discord rang too loudly for his murderer's ears. I stared at the ciphered words, unable fully to grasp their significance, yet keenly aware of their weight. Holmes folded the slip with care. This, he remarked, is what men call a trifle, a scribble on paper, scarcely worth the ink that formed it. Yet to the ambitious clerk it seemed a ladder. To Collard it was a marketable good. And to England it was almost a wound at her very heart. As Holmes spoke, my thoughts turned with melancholy insistence to Rigby himself. I recalled the murmurs of his colleagues, how he had dreamed of advancement, of climbing beyond the narrow confines of his station. Ambition, unchecked by wisdom, had led him into shadows where stronger men would have faltered. I could not help but pity him, for in his desire to grasp more than his due, he had forfeited even the little he possessed. Yet in his final act there was a glimmer of redemption. He resisted, however vainly, the treachery that threatened to engulf him. I set down my pen with a sigh. The poor fellow wanted only to rise, I said softly. Holmes glanced at me, his eyes unreadable through the haze of smoke. Many a man, Watson, has stumbled upward only to find the staircase ends in a precipice. Holmes leaned back at last, his long fingers interlaced, and allowed the silence of the room to settle around us. Then, with that dry humour which so often masked his weariness, he observed, "We live, Watson, in an age when truth must crawl on weary feet, while falsehood runs upon wires. Lies stretch themselves from Bloomsbury to Calcutta in the blink of an eye, while fact plods behind with its boots caked in mud. Yet truth, though slower, has the advantage of arriving intact. Collard's lies sped swiftly, but they could not endure a single trifling match, a scratch in wood, or a phantom word upon a blotter." He tapped the packet gently with one finger. "The Empire may rest safe tonight, thanks not to the thunder of cannon, but to the whisper of a dead man's pen. That is the curious arithmetic of our time." I smiled faintly. though my heart was heavy with thoughts of Rigby. And so, with the fire burning low and Holmes's sardonic smile lingering in my memory, the case of the murdered telegraphist was brought at last to its conclusion. The tumult of the case behind us, Holmes and I sat once more before the familiar fire of Baker Street. The glow of the coals, the ticking of the clock, and the quiet beyond our window brought a comfort which only the conclusion of danger can bestow. Lestrade had gone, the last echoes of the station's uproar silenced, and our rooms resumed their accustomed peace. Holmes lounged in his armchair, his pipe drawing little spirals of smoke that wavered toward the ceiling. I, pen in hand, felt the peculiar satisfaction of one who has witnessed another drama resolved. There is no moment, I think, more agreeable than this quiet after the storm. The world returned to order, if only for a time. As I sat there, my thoughts turned to the strange instrument which had been at the heart of our adventure. The telegraph, that marvel of modern science, had bound continents together with a thread of copper and sparks of fire, yet it had also bound Rigby to his fate. What was devised for progress and knowledge had become in unworthy hands a servant of crime. One might well ask whether invention enlarges virtue as swiftly as it enlarges power. For myself, I could not look upon the clicking machine without a sense of foreboding, as though each message might conceal, beneath its innocent symbols, the germ of some new mischief. It was a sobering reflection amidst our comfortable peace. Holmes, perceiving my meditations as clearly as if I had spoken them aloud, gave a soft chuckle. "Do not trouble yourself overmuch, Watson. Falsehood has always travelled faster than truth. The only novelty is that now it runs upon wires instead of tongues. Yet mark the distinction. Truth, though slower, does not tire, and when it arrives, it is whole. Lies, however swift, decay as they fly. Collard's falsehoods sped across London like sparks in a storm, but in the end they guttered out before the simple light of a half-burnt match and a scarred desk." He leaned back, his eyes half closed. "It is a contest as old as man, my dear fellow. Falsehood may claim the start, but truth secures the finish." I could not but notice a faint smile touch Holmes's lips as he uttered these words. It was not the smile of triumph, nor the cynical twist with which he often rebuked folly, but something subtler, as though he held in reluctant esteem those who dared to pit their wits against him. However contemptible Collard's motives, Holmes seemed to recognize in the man's audacity a glimmer of the courage that belongs to the desperate. I marvelled, as I often did, at the strange complexity of my friend, so cold in reasoning, yet betraying, in these fleeting moments, a trace of respect for even the most misguided opponent. The gravity of the hour did not prevent Holmes from indulging his customary humour. As I set down my pen, he remarked with mock seriousness, "It is fortunate, Watson, that you did not mistake Rigby's blotter for a tonic water advertisement, as you once did with that Morse code pamphlet." I confess I flushed at the recollection, for my error had been the subject of much teasing on a former occasion. "You have a long memory for my blunders," I retorted. Holmes laughed quietly. "They are my best antidote to ennui, my dear fellow. Without them, the world would be intolerably dull." The fire burned lower, the smoke curled lazily, and a companionable silence descended. Holmes at last stretched his long limbs and glanced toward the mantel, where a stack of letters awaited his attention. "There are more wires to be untangled, Watson," said he, "and some, I dare say, may prove knottier than this." His tone was light, yet I caught in it the promise of further adventures looming upon the horizon. I closed my notebook with a sense of quiet expectation, for I knew that wherever crime and mystery sought to conceal themselves, my friend's keen eyes would soon pierce their veil. Holmes leaned back in his chair, the smoke from his pipe curling like a ribbon above him. "You see, Watson," he said quietly, "in this age of wires and instant communication, falsehood may race ahead of truth with alarming speed, yet it is always truth, however slow, that endures. Collard thought he could outpace it, but the smallest trifles betrayed him." I nodded, struck by the somber wisdom of his words. And now I wonder, what do you think was Collard's greatest mistake? His greed, his carelessness, or his attempt to turn suspicion upon Milburn? Share your thoughts below. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to comment, subscribe, and share it with fellow lovers of Sherlock Holmes. Many more cases await.